It's The World This Week, The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from Bogota, Colombia, Alvaro Sierra, who cracks the whip at France 24 en Español. How are you?
How are you? How are you, Francois?
I'm fine.
Fine, here in Bogota.
Okay. Pleased to hear it. Pleased to welcome Ana Navarro Pedro, Paris correspondent for Portuguese news weekly Visão.
Nice to be here.
Nice to see you in the flesh. Catherine Field, Europe correspondent for New Zealand Media and Entertainment. Slow week again, right?
Yes, slow week again. It was so slow I took Wednesday off and went to the Louvre.
Okay. We'll talk about that in part two of our discussion. And from Newcastle in England, our Royals correspondent Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Where does one find World Politics Review?
At worldpoliticsreview.com, and for once I'm not the Vatican correspondent.
Okay. World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. On a more serious note, 11 days, hundreds killed, and both sides declaring victory. Celebrations taking place overnight in the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and as you can see here at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa mosque compound after a ceasefire ended the bloodiest conflict in 7 years between Israel and Gaza. The other side also saying they are the winners.
11 ימים ולילות של מהלומות כבירות וכתישה אדירה ששינו את כללי המשחק. אני רוצה להדגיש את זה יותר מכל דבר אחר. אנחנו שינינו את המשוואה לא רק לימי המבצע ותוך כדי המבצע, אנחנו שינינו את המשוואה גם להמשך.
We changed the equation, Catherine Field, says Israel's prime minister. Do we know if that is the case or not?
Well, let's look at what's changed. We're in the cycle of Israel saying they're threatened by the presence of Hamas, Hamas saying they cannot live with Israel continually bombing them, not allowing them to have their human rights, not allowing them to live normal lives. Two-state solution hasn't been resolved. Final status of Jerusalem hasn't been resolved. The Golan Heights is still a question mark over the occupation of the Golan Heights. I'm not sure what's been resolved. We're in the cycle of attacks against Israel, attacks against Hamas, and whilever the Israeli government feels they can pursue this, what the Israeli Defense Force says and what some of the intelligence officers say, they feel they keep needing to prove to Palestinians that they are in charge. And I think that quote that we heard this week from the Israeli Defense Force, or was it from the intelligence officers, saying, yeah, every now and then we need to go and mow the grass, which means there's going to be military missions against the Palestinians. So prove me wrong. I don't see what's changed.
What has changed in 11 days, Ana Navarro Pedro?
Maybe a even more far-reaching possibility for a solution of this conflict. We have seen that Hamas really has won the hearts of the Palestinians, even in the West Bank, because it has been seen as the only Palestinian movement who really stood up for Palestinians in East Jerusalem when things got hot down there for Palestinians. Abbas and the Fatah have lost a bit more of their standing and their popularity amongst Palestinians. Hamas is now maybe the opponent of Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu probably has won maybe the hearts of some Israelis, and maybe he can now form a government or win more votes in the next elections. But what we are not seeing is the possibility of any solution, and the positions are very radicalized. West Bank is being more and more annexed by Israel. There are really infrastructures that are being built down there so heavily that make the two-state solution that has been on the table for a long time less and less plausible, less and less possible.
Okay, So several things different this time. I'll put it to you, Judah Grunstein. First of all, it was Hamas who struck first on May the 10th. Secondly, it was started because of Jerusalem this time, not because of Gaza. And third, we had Arab Israelis who took part in that general strike this week. So is it just the same as Catherine says? We're just in this endless cycle that will be repeated eventually?
I think I'd kind of come down in between Catherine and Anna. I think there are a lot of things that have not changed. First of all, militarily, very little has changed. Mow the grass means that it's a regularly scheduled operation. It means that Israel acknowledges that, in fact, it can't change the equation, and it has to essentially repeatedly go back in to reestablish deterrence. I think that what has changed is that, first of all, Hamas did demonstrate a much greater capacity and capability in terms of the range of its rockets and how many it could fire at once, which effectively saturated the Iron Dome system. So from now on, Israel will have to take into consideration the fact that Hamas can cause casualties and that there will be damage on the Israeli side as well. Until now, it's been very one-sided, these military conflicts. I think the other thing that has changed, I think we're still in a taking stock period in terms of Israeli politics, is the Israeli population often soon after a conflict begins to really criticize the military leadership and political leadership for it. So I'm not sure Netanyahu is out of the woods yet. I think that the Hamas sort of rally around the flag period will be short-lived, because I don't think Hamas is necessarily that popular. I think what has really dramatically changed is the sort of social and identity consciousness among Palestinians, but also outside of this conflict. I think that what you saw was a full response from across the population, across the society, whether it was the military response of Hamas, the national strike and protest by Israeli and Israeli Arabs, as well as Palestinians from the occupied territories. And I think that from outside, I think what we've seen more this time is a realization that thinking of it as a two-state solution and thinking of it with the green line cutting in between Israel and the West Bank and Hamas or Gaza is increasingly irrelevant. And that really the scale and the framework to think of this is as one country from the Jordan River to the sea. And as unrealistic as a one-state solution sounds to everyone, and as unworkable as it is, that is the growing sort of advocacy claim among Palestinian activists, especially the younger generation, among liberals in America, for instance, liberal Jews who will be increasingly pressuring the American government, I think, toward that. So I think that is a major shift, even if it might take another 5-10 years before it becomes even something that can be realistic. But I do think that in terms of the consciousness and framework of how this is looked at, both within the Palestinian population and from abroad, that is the major change from this round of fighting.
Alvaro Serra, it caught everyone by surprise, and we know that just a few months back, you had Israel normalizing ties with a host of Arab states. At the time, people thought, oh, well, the Palestinian issue can perhaps be resolved from the outside in. Let's try a novel approach. What have you learned from the last 11 days?
Well, I am really sorry to say that I didn't learn anything new. For me, that's the main problem. I tend to agree with what my colleagues have been saying. But the problem is we are seeing more of the same, with one exception, which were the protests on the side of the Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis. For the rest is rockets get into Israel, bombing gets against Gaza. These kind of clashes only reinforce the most radical positions on both sides. I'm not sure that if elections come, they have been delayed, but when elections come, I'm not sure Hamas may have a big win. So the possibilities for a peace deal, which were already very difficult, seem much farther away. That's the first thing. The second important thing, and that's the one that has changed from my view, is, as my colleague just mentioned, are the protests in the population, the Arab Israeli population or the Palestinian Arab population manifesting in the streets. That's new. That didn't happen often before, and it didn't happen since a long time ago. And that opens for Israel a kind of second front inside Israel, which will not be easy to deal with, I think, for Netanyahu or whomever succeeds him, and that puts the people on the streets on the forefront of the situation. That's a new element that can introduce new possibilities into the whole process. But as far as I see the whole thing, as we saw in 2014 and before, those clashes arise. Radical positions on both sides get stronger and stronger, and nothing changes, and there is nothing that can approach a possible political solution or a kind of peace process that seems less and less feasible now.
All right. And we were seeing that one country had kind of hoped that it wouldn't have to deal with this fire to put out, and that's the United States. Joe Biden in the past days calling for de-escalation publicly, not a ceasefire. He chooses his words carefully. He remembers back in 2014, the then U.S. President, Barack Obama, calling for a ceasefire and immediately making himself what one Washington think tanker called an irrelevant factor. The war then continued for 52 days. Joe Biden has known Benjamin Netanyahu since 1982. They've had their ups and downs. This was a down. This is 2010, when Netanyahu humiliated the then vice president by announcing more settlement building while Biden was in town. Let's listen to the new U.S. president after Thursday's ceasefire announcement.
I believe the Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live safely and securely and to enjoy equal measures of freedom, prosperity, and democracy. My administration will continue our quiet and relentless diplomacy toward that end.
So we don't know how he did because we don't know what happened behind closed doors, Ana Navarro Pedro.
No.
But would the U.S. says, look, it's better to put the pressure on Netanyahu privately than go public with it and make him take a stand and recoil.
Probably.
How do you think Biden's done this week?
I won't dare to guess, but we can see a few factors. One, Netanyahu didn't want to go into Gaza militarily because it would be too expensive for them, and they don't need to. They got their military goals with just what they had done. Secondly, public opinion in the world wasn't. It was more divided this time than before, and in the United States, Joe Biden was elected with the traditional Democrats, but also with the progressives, with the Black Lives Matter, with the feminists, and with Justice Democrats and so forth. Those are much more pro-Palestinian or much more pro a solution, and not so much giving total impunity to Israel government in her actions. And so Joe Biden has to take that into account for elections. He has a Palestinian, an American representative in the House of Representatives, in the Congress, a Palestinian American elected, and she has a power of a voice as well. So he has to be more prudent, and I believe Netanyahu, he had not. It wouldn't be more interesting for him to have more pursued the conflict. You know that Hamas is his enemy in Gaza Strip. He could give a little more loose area for local businessmen to act in Gaza. And he could have maybe more, how do you say interlocuteur in English? More
dialogue.
More dialogue, more people with dialogue in Gaza than he has. Now everything is blocked with Hamas. So he knows very well what he's doing. If he wanted to do, if Israel politicians wanted to do things differently, they could.
All right.
You know, one of the things I noticed when we were talking about the US was that the US Secretary of State didn't jump on the plane and go to Israel. I mean, how many times have we seen during an Arab-Israeli conflict, we've seen the Secretary of State fly in, try and solve it, get angry, rush to the airport, jump on the plane, go away. And I thought they were sort of showing that this was going to be a bit different than before. The Deputy Undersecretary was sent out there. So it was a very different way of dealing with it, as you rightly say, because the pressure internally in America is so different than it was before.
By the way, the conflict in the Middle East, a possible factor in an unexpected crisis at the other end of the Mediterranean. We all seen the image of a 2-month-old baby rescued by the Spanish Coast Guard in the enclave of Ceuta, coming amid a record influx of 8,000 migrants. The Moroccans lowering their guard at the border amid outrage over Madrid's decision to allow in the Secretary General of the Polisario Front for treatment. Some call it a calling card. But this crisis, Alvaro Sierra, coming at a time when the Moroccans have recently normalized ties with Israel. There is strong support among the population for the Palestinian cause. Is it just a coincidence of the calendar, or is it a factor?
I would say that's a coincidence. It can play, obviously, a role, but for me, both things just happen to happen on the same moment. Let's put it that way. I am not sure that will severely change the equation. The fact that Morocco gets into the play, let's say, Morocco has recognized Israel. Morocco has the backing of important European countries like France and Spain, and Morocco has its own game. One thing is recognizing Israel, and another thing, and I think is different, is unrelated, how it has used the migrants to pressure Europe for other considerations and other reasons.
Like Turkey.
For example, what I see here, for example, is that they would be looking for a deal like the one Turkey struck with the European Union 5 years ago. Money in the European Union more or less agreeing with Turkey, I will give you money and you will take care of an external border of mine and not let the Syrians cross the border, the Mediterranean into Europe. Here, Morocco looks or aspires to something similar. The problem is that, from my point of view, it's not easy that the European Union will accept some kind of deal like this, because it would have to accept other deals in other places. And so far, Morocco is not in a position of force, I would say. Morocco can feel Rabat can feel itself strongest since Donald Trump clinched with Morocco the deal to recognize Israel, but Morocco is heavily dependent on European aid. They have received a lot of money from the European Union. The European Union threatened more or less to look at this aid if Morocco continues to open the door to migrants into Ceuta. So far, I don't see that both things, what happened in Israel and what just happened in Ceuta, are related. And Morocco and the European Union have a problem.
A quick break. We'll be right back with more. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. We're in the company from Bogota, Colombia, of Alvaro Sierra, director of France 24's Spanish language channel. Ana Navarro Pedro is Paris correspondent for Portuguese news magazine Visão. Catherine Field, Europe correspondent for New Zealand Media and Entertainment, and from Newcastle, Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Just before the break, we were talking about the crisis in that Spanish enclave of Ceuta on the Moroccan coast. It obliged Spain's prime minister to cancel a trip to Paris to an important African finance summit earlier this week. Socialist Pedro Sanchez, whose government working to calm tensions with Morocco without appearing as though it's conceding.
We will not accept any kind of blackmail. Spain's integrity is non-negotiable.
So, Ana Navarro-Pedro, this is about the Polisario Front, right?
This is about Polisario Front and Western Sahara. Of course, Morocco is very, very touchy about that subject. They've got now their backs a little bit more held by the United States since Trump recognized their sovereign power over that territory. So, yes. And there is something else at the very least. This government doesn't seem to be very, very, very sharp on international relations. You know, the first visit every prime minister of Spain ever does when he gets into power is to go to Rabat.
Not to Paris?
Not to Paris, to Rabat.
Or
It
to Lisbon.
shows you the importance of the relations between the two countries. Now, Pedro Sanchez, he wasn't able to meet the king of Morocco for about 6 months, 4 months in 2018 when he came to power. It lasted a long time. Before that, the king and the queen of Spain had to adjourn a state official visit to Morocco. So there are little
And this is before the Abraham Accords were signed and the normalization of ties.
And this was before. So there are little tensions between Morocco and Spain. Of course, Morocco doesn't really appreciate those two colonies, Ceuta and Melilla, Spanish colonies in their territory. And then there was this big blunder by Spain. They accepted the leader of the Polisario.
A blunder?
A blunder, a diplomatic blunder. They accepted in a hospital in Spain the leader of the Polisario Front, but they didn't warn Rabat they were going to accept it, and they also allowed him to travel into the country under a false identity, a false passport. And of course, the Moroccan secret services are some of the best in the world. And they immediately found out about that. And there was no phone call to Rabat to warn about it. And that is something that it's not going very well with the king and the palace. Now, showing the strength by letting all the migrants going into Ceuta as they did. That was the question that was asked before by our colleague in South America. It was really a blunder also by Morocco because the very heavy aid the European Union gives to them, as our friend recalled as well, part of it is for a not so much publicized deal that they don't allow all the people that come from sub-Saharan Africa, as well as all their kids, Moroccan kids, want to come to Europe. They don't allow to get into European territory in North Africa. So things have calmed down now, but they don't seem to have really settled down. And the fact that
the story will be back is what you're
saying. And the fact that Spain is really refusing, I'll finish right now, is refusing to acknowledge that this has to do with the Polisario Front is also something quite astonishing.
All right. By the way, it's going bad from worse for Colombia, now stripped of co-hosting duties for the upcoming Copa America football tournament. All the matches will instead be played in Argentina. The regional football governing body sees no end in sight to the current social unrest that started with a tax revolt and has spread to calls for better public services, better governance, and less police and paramilitary brutality.
Marchamos, los ambientalistas marchan, los indígenas marchan, los trabajadores marchan, como que es que hay demasiadas cuentas pendientes y el man está solo.
Y este gobierno quiere tildar a todo aquel que proteste, que salga a la calle en contra.
You heard that protester, Alvaro Sierra. Is the president deaf? I mean, he's been having negotiations.
the situation here in Colombia is quite unbelievable, you could say, without inconvenience. The president has been the government and the president have been delaying the opening of formal negotiations with the people that are protagonizing the protests. Those, at least for the first couple of weeks of the protests, we are not getting into the 22nd day, and things do not seem to get calmer. The protests went on, and the government began to react, and 10 days, 12 days after they began, President Duque opened the way for a dialogue. But the problem was that he undertook a dialogue with everyone but the people that were in the streets. We have a national committee for the protest. It's called the El Comité de Paro, the strike committee. And you have hundreds of small organizations or individuals, mainly young people, who do not, who are not affiliated to a union, who are not in an organization, and all these people are on the streets. Finally, after those dialogues with politicians, businessmen, etc., the president opened the door to have, he named one of his ministers to have a dialogue with the Comité de Paro. The Comité de Paro has said that it will only begin the conversation, the proper negotiations. They have a 15-point letter of demands. They will only begin those negotiations if police violence, which has been really serious in Colombia, historically in former protests, and especially in this one. We are between, depends on the numbers and the sources, we have between 40 and 55 people dead in the protests, among other things. So the two times that the government has met the Comité de Paro, the National Strike Committee, negotiations have gone nowhere. And a good part of the people who is on the streets do not agree with this kind of negotiation because they say that the National Strike Committee do not represent them. The president, besides that, has begun to concede some things. So he reversed the tax reform. Before yesterday, the health reform was killed in Congress. He announced two measures to try to help youth to get unemployment and to get housing. And two ministers have departed. The Minister of Finances, the author of the tax reform, and then Claudia Blum, the Foreign Minister. But nothing of this seems to calm things down. The people are feeling on the streets, and when you talk to the people on the streets, people are feeling that they have too many grievances and that the government is deaf to those grievances, and the answer has been mainly through police brutality. That's what has, I believe, the main fuel for the manifestations here in Colombia is that element, police brutality.
Police brutality, the police, which, by the way, in Colombia answer to the army, to the defense ministry, not to the interior ministry. Judah Grunstein, you listened to Alvaro say it's day 22 and there's no end in sight. Your reaction?
Well, a couple of things. To begin with, this is the third major outbreak of protests in Colombia since the fall of 2019. There was already a protest then. I believe it was regarding pension reform, but Alvaro can correct me if I'm wrong. In September, there was already another outbreak of protests against specifically police brutality. And now these. So clearly there's a lot of pent-up grievances. I think when I think of how we've covered Colombia in the last 4 or 5 years or so, I think there was this expectation of a peace dividend after the end of the conflict with the FARC. And instead, what's happened over the course of those years is that there's been an incredible targeted campaign of targeted violence against indigenous leaders, against labor rights activists, and against social justice movements and activists. And then add on top of that the fact that you have a police and security apparatus that is really geared towards the counterinsurgency and war frame of fighting the FARC, and has never really engaged, has engaged in human rights atrocities, including the false positive scandals during the Civil War, but has never, first of all, addressed those kinds of issues. But then, even after the peace agreement was signed, hasn't engaged in any meaningful amount of reform, security sector reform, to shift that footing in any way. And we've seen it over the course of these protests, over the course of the protests in September of last year. So I think this question of is it surprising that the protests last this long? Duque was elected essentially as a lame duck because he was seen as a puppet of Alvaro Uribe. He's now officially a lame duck because he can't run again. I believe the elections are next year. He's never really been seen as a very strong or decisive leader. So no, it's not surprising that they've lasted this long, because I think the problems are very fundamental. They're very deeply ingrained in Colombian society. They're the same problems and issues that were at the heart of the Civil War that lasted 50 or 60 years. And the peace process, in quotation marks, that was supposed to address them really was stillborn because Duque wasn't committed to it. So I think for all those reasons, no, it's not surprising at all to see these protests, to see them not go addressed, and to see them continue.
Catherine Field, there is this thought that what's going on in Colombia could be a cautionary tale for a lot of countries, because you had grievances, then you had COVID, people put a lid on them, and all right, they've had enough now, and we're entering into wintertime in Latin America, by the way, and you know, it's back to lockdown in certain places like Argentina, and the idea, if you don't address these grievances, anything can spark it.
There are serious grievances in a lot of South American countries, and they're generally to do with inequalities and poverty. And as the economies start really crumbling after all this, the knock that it's taken because of COVID, you're going to have increased taxes here and there. You're going to have people, this is exactly what we've been seeing in places like Colombia. You're going to have the poor getting poorer. And the poor now have far more of an opportunity to express their grievances. There is also this...
And COVID accelerates that.
COVID accelerates it. We've also got this idea of justice for everyone. Now, this is something that's fed into the Israel-Palestinian thing. This notion that everyone deserves to have just a basic minimum. And you're seeing this in Colombia, you're seeing it also in Chile. And these are problems that have just not been addressed, as you rightly say, for decades, and it's gotten worse. And these are countries, particularly Colombia, where the vaccine rollout's been very, very slow.
All right. We saw when mass protests erupted in 2019, Chile's conservative president agreed to a key demand.
Yes. Change
the constitution. The old one was the ghost of the Pinochet dictatorship. The week began with Sebastián Piñera, the conservative president, waking up to results which have him only with 1/5 of the seats in the Constituent Assembly. And a reminder, Chile began because, what was it, the metro ticket prices is what started it.
Exactly.
So I ask, here in France, should we be paying attention? Is this could there be something like this?
Can I tell you something, what the scholars are saying in Latin America, universities in Latin America? They're saying that this uprising in Latin American countries has nothing to do with previous uprisings in the population. I think it was Uribe who called it in Colombia dispersed molecular revolution. And there is a lot to be seen in that, because there are so many different areas of the society aggregating at the same time, being so dispersed and so forth. But
in Chile, it's more simple, right? They got what they wanted, a constitutional assembly, and they're changing the constitution.
2 years, yes, and now there are one big chunk of the elected people are independent ones. And what they are saying is that, contrary to what we have been saying, that the 21st century started in 9/11, with the Twin Towers in New York, that it started actually in the 17th of December, 2010, with one little Tunisian protesting against police brutality and arbitrary decision, and setting fire on himself and setting then on the revolutions. And you say all of these movements, the Arab revolutions, the uprising in Latin America, the Gilets jaunes in France as well, and other protests, they are all one thing, is populations not accepting anymore being impoverished and neoliberal economies.
And after lockdown, there's a lot of pent-up frustration. So if you love Paris in the springtime, then never mind the rain on Wednesday. That was the day cafes reopened for the first time in more than 6 months, along with theaters, movie houses, museums. The easing of lockdown feted with a photo op by the French president and his prime minister, bright and early, so the pictures could be out there all day long. There you see it. Catherine Field, your thoughts on this easing of lockdown?
Well, I mean, what can I say? But it's absolutely wonderful. As I said, I took the day off on Wednesday and went to the Louvre, and can I tell you, it is fabulous. There's barely anyone there. It's clean. They've spent 6 months cleaning all the glass.
Because the foreign tourists have not returned yet.
The foreign tourists haven't returned, and also there's they've got the ratio of how many people per square meter, and so it was wonderful. You can go in, you can see old friends like Venus de Milo, and you can see Liberty leading the people.
Well, let's ask the exiled Judah Grunstein about that.
What's the actual question?
Yeah. The easing of lockdown, when you hear Catherine describing her day out at the museum.
It sounds lovely. I mean, we have had some loosening up here in the UK and where we are over the course of the past week too. In Newcastle, we were in lockdown essentially since November or December. Not quite as strict as in France because they weren't too particular about going outside for walks and things like that. Yeah, I saw the photos. I saw photos of people at some of the cafes and terraces that I've been to and that I've frequented. I think that. There's just going to be, and I don't think we're quite out of the woods yet, but I think that over the course of the next year, there's going to be a real reckoning as we return back to normal, and a true normal where we can really stop looking behind us and forget where we put the masks with everything that's gone on in the past year. And I think that there will be a moment for real celebration, a moment for that kind of joy. Maybe it won't be the kind of photo opportunity that the VE Day and VJ Day celebrations in the States and Europe were for the generation of World War II. But I do think there will be that kind of euphoria. At the same time, I think that something that Anna said is very important about what those protests in South America and around the world have been about, and that one of those big issues has been the neoliberal model. I think the post-pandemic world is going to have a totally different model in terms of government's role, in terms of what people expect from government. I think some things will be very different. And I think we haven't yet really imagined how that will even change everyday reality of going to the terrace, of going to museums, who will be in the museums, what international tourism will look like, how crowded will tourist destinations like Paris still be? Will it just go all back to the way it was 2 years ago? A year and a half ago? Will things change? Will there be a more sustainable approach to all of these things that we kind of got used to over the course of 10 or 15 years? But really, the Louvre was never that crowded. The terrace in Paris was never that much to get a seat at.
What time were you going?
I used to go
I'm just
there.
saying there might be real long-term effects of the past year and a half. In some ways for positive. Cities might become a little more livable. Vacationing might become a little more sustainable. And people's, those minimum demands for justice and equality that Anna mentioned might be more strongly demanded. So I see it sort of in a long historical framework more than in just an opening this week.
If I could just mention one thing, that when you heard Emmanuel Macron, the French president, having his coffee, and he was very quick to praise the French people. He said, we did this, it was us. And it's not very often that you have a French president who comes out of his his wonderful palace to talk about what we did as a nation, showing humility and showing that he's going to have to carry the population with him and thank the population.
In dire straits as well, so politically.
Alvaro Sierra, have you had time yet to reflect on what the post-pandemic world will look like?
Well, yeah, we covered the news about Macron's photo op at the cafe. I would say a couple of things. The first one is I think it's a really good piece of PR. To choose such a symbolic thing for the French people, you know, the cafe, these tiny tables, people clinging around, sitting around, and so on. To choose that, as my colleague said, to tell the French people, listen, life is slowly going back to normal, and we all together did this. I think it was a good public relations operation. That's the first thing. The second thing, and going back to what another of my colleagues has said, is we should not forget that we are in the middle of the pandemic. Here in Colombia, for example, we had a very strict lockdown, and just a few weeks ago, you can visit cafes and places, but only until 8 p.m. Alcohol was forbidden. There was a curfew, and just before this third wave, they relaxed a little bit those measures. Now the curfew begins at 11 p.m., for example, before it was at 8 p.m. And nonetheless, the pandemic is going on and growing here, especially in South America, which is the region of the world most seriously affected. So I would say that we should not forget that the pandemic is far from over, and that these kind of measures, for example, opening cafes and restaurants, that give people some breath and some feeling that things finally are going back to some kind of normality, may be transitory, may be temporary. For example, one big question, and we ask this question especially in the countries of the South.
Very briefly, because we're out of time.
Well, the first world, well, just to put it, the world has to get out from the pandemic. It is not enough that the rich countries of the world will vaccinate, while the rest of the world will not be able to vaccinate. The pandemic will go on.
Yeah, the race of variants versus vaccines. Alvaro Sierra, many thanks for joining us from France 24's Spanish language headquarters in Bogota. I want to thank Judah Grunstein in Newcastle, Ana Navarro, Pedro, Catherine Field. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.